Secure your podcast. Essential contracts every podcaster needs. Are you protecting your podcast the right way? Well, today we're breaking down the must-have contracts that every podcaster needs to secure their content and avoid legal pitfalls. Get ready for a comprehensive guide right here on Legit Podcast Pro. Welcome to Legit Podcast Pro, everyone. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and today we're diving into a crucial aspect of podcasting that might not be the first thing on your mind, but it really ought to be pretty high on your list. Contracts. From guest appearances to co-hosting to freelance contributions and music, we're going to cover essential agreements that keep your podcast legally sound. And don't forget music licensing. We're going to talk about that at the end too. So let's just get started right away. First off, let's talk about the guest release form. This isn't just idle paperwork. It's your first line of defense. Well, what is it? It's a guest release form that is essentially a legal agreement where your guests give you consent to be recorded and to use their voice and image and other contributions used in your podcast as well as in other media. You need this ideally before they ever step up to the microphone, because this document is what clarifies that you have this right to record them and the absolute right to use the content however you see fit. Sure, as a podcast episode, but what about as a paid series or inside a digital product or transcribed as part of a book? The possibilities are endless. And I'll tell you, the agreement form that I've created is set up to allow you as broad and open-ended a use case for your content as you might want. You can always tweak that and adjust it, but if you're interested, we have a podcast guest release that you can get for free by visiting podcastrelease.com. I say use this all the time. It protects you by preventing guests from later claiming that they didn't agree to certain uses of the content, or that they were supposed to get paid, or were supposed to have some kind of approval rights before your episode got published. And it eliminates their ability to demand that you take down the episode. You still can if you want to, if it's the right thing to do, but you won't have to. Now, without a release, you could face legal challenges if the guest decides they no longer want that episode published. One podcast I advised had to remove several episodes from their catalog because the guests later disagreed with how the interview was being marketed and the nature of the editorial approach the show was taking. And the trouble is, the podcaster felt that they were doing important journalism and that the news story needed to get out and that the episode should stay up. And that actually devolved into a very expensive lawsuit. And the sponsor who pays for an episode to be published in the first place expects that it and the sponsor's advertising message will continue to be available. So by taking down an episode, by allowing your guest to force you into that position, could actually put you in breach of your contract with your sponsor by taking it down. So the bottom line is practice safe guest. Use a release form with every guest every time. Now let's talk about the co-host agreement. Well, what is this? Well, this is one of the kinds of agreements that I refer to as a podcast prenup. In this case, it's a contract that outlines the responsibilities, the rights, and the expectations between the co-hosts. When you need it, right at the start of any collaborative hosting arrangement, at the beginning. Why is it necessary? Well, it ensures that everyone starts out on the same page regarding their contributions to the project and the profit sharing and what happens if someone decides to leave or needs to be shown the door or gets disabled or dies or something like that. The co-host agreement helps avoid disputes by detailing everything related to ownership of the podcast and revenue sharing and how departures are going to be handled all up front. Without it, well, you can imagine the kinds of disputes that come up over money when one party funds the podcast, does most of the work or what have you, and the other thinks the money should still be shared equally. Or imagine your co-host just leaves suddenly, but still expects a portion of the revenue. or even wants episodes taken down. This will help you. Real life examples have played out with more than a few very popular podcasts and famous podcasters, where a departing co-host or co-producer claimed half the revenue and ownership of the intellectual property. Without the co-host agreement setting forth expectations early on, the result is a lengthy legal battle. So, if you're working with co-hosts or co-producers or co-anything, have an agreement in place from the very beginning. It'll save lots of regrets, headaches, and hard feelings, not to mention time and money. The next kind of contract we should be talking about is the independent contractor agreement. Let's face it, podcasting isn't easy, and at some point you're gonna need some help. In fact, you probably ought to be building a team so you can keep the project moving and the momentum and focus on your zone of genius while you let other people do some of the other kinds of lifting. The independent contractor agreement is used when you hire someone who isn't a bona fide employee. Employees, the results and the output of an employee's work belongs to the company that it works for, the employer, right away. For example, though, if you were hiring an independent editor or a graphic designer or someone like that who's going to work for your podcast, but also maybe on others, they're an independent contractor. And anytime you engage freelancers or contractors, you should have a written agreement. These documents sets forth clear terms for the job. It avoids any confusion about the person's role and compensation, and clarifies that the work they do for you is a contract basis, protecting you from employment law issues, tax issues, and it ensures that you own the content that they help create. Let me say that again. It helps ensure that you own the content they help you create. That's not how copyright law works by default. Even if you pay them to create it, an independent non-employee who creates something owns it, unless there's a written agreement with some very specific language that specifies that their output is work made for hire. Now, without this kind of contract and this language in place, disputes can and do arise about ownership of the work that's produced. I've seen producers lose rights to their podcast cover art after something happens, and because the contract with the designer didn't specify that the podcaster would own the rights. And in different areas of entertainment, this comes up too. Famously, the writer of the hit Broadway musical Rent almost wound up sharing his royalties with a contractor that he'd brought on just to help out with some minor tweaks to the show. So anyone who's touching your podcast in any way should sign a contract so that you and they know exactly what's expected, what they get, and what they don't get out of the deal. Now let's talk about music licenses. A license is a contract that gives you permission to do something using someone else's property. So in this case, to legally use music written or recorded by someone else in your podcast, you need a music license, probably two. Anytime you include copyrighted music in your episodes, you will need this kind of permission. And yes, nearly all music that you might want to use is copyrighted. And you probably need two licenses, one from the songwriter or the publisher, and one from the record company or artist that recorded the song. That's right, the recording and the underlying musical composition are two separate copyrighted works. Without a license, you could be subject to, well, at the very least, DMCA takedowns and copyright strikes with your hosting platforms, YouTube or whatever podcast host you use. But you could also face copyright infringement claims in big boy federal court, making it a federal case. And that can be extremely costly as well as very damaging to your reputation and your pocketbook. Now, we don't hear about this kind of thing happening that often, and that's because most of the time cases settle privately. But I'll tell you that even those private situations, I've seen more than one podcast pay out tens of thousands of dollars just to get straight with music rights holders, and they still had to take the episodes down because they used copyrighted music without permission. So bottom line, make sure you have and that you have read the license terms for any music or other material that you use, and hold on to those licenses. Keep records. Using contracts doesn't have to be hard. Contrary to what many folks believe, guests, co-hosts, contractors, composers, artists, they will respect you for your business savvy when you ask them to sign a contract, especially if it's a simple, easy to understand document. Now, fortunately, you probably won't need to hire a lawyer to get these contracts together for you. And that's because I've already drafted them. Just head on over to podcastlawforms.com to access these and many other contract templates I've designed specifically for podcasters like you. Using good contracts is an important part of behaving like a legit podcast pro. And if this all resonates at all for you, I want to encourage you to join me for my free podcast growth and profit workshop that's coming up soon. In this session, I will share with you a few of the most common podcasting mistakes that hold podcasters back from the impact, influence, and income they desire. And I'll show you how to avoid those mistakes and what to do instead. So register today at podcastlaw.net. That's podcastlaw.net. And that's it for today's episode of Legit Podcast Pro. We've talked about the essential contracts that'll help secure your podcast future. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, wishing you safe and sound podcasting. And until next time, keep on podcasting and keep on keeping it legal.